3 days ago, on September 23, 2025, the world woke to headlines it did not expect. In coordinated announcements from Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, the military governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger declared their immediate withdrawal from the International Criminal Court. But this was not a quiet diplomatic exit. It was a public execution of the court's credibility. For 20 years, the joint statement read, "The ICC has hunted African leaders while protecting Western war criminals. Today, we declare this court what it has always been, a tool of neo-colonial repression dressed in judicial robes." The words cut through diplomatic niceties like a machete through sugarcane. No committees would review this decision. No negotiations would soften it. 3 of the world's poorest nations had just told Europe's most prestigious legal institution that its authority was rejected, its legitimacy was fraudulent, and its time in Africa was over. In Brussels, emergency meetings convened before dawn. In Washington, State Department officials scrambled for responses. In The Hague itself, prosecutors who had spent years building cases against Sahelian military leaders suddenly found their jurisdiction evaporating. The institution that claimed to represent global justice had just been branded a colonial courthouse by the very continent it claimed to protect. What made this moment explosive was not just the withdrawal itself, as other nations had threatened to leave before. What shook the international order was the language, raw, unfiltered, and accusatory. These 3 nations did not simply leave the ICC, they put it on trial in the court of global opinion. They transformed themselves from defendants into prosecutors, turning 20 years of selective justice into evidence of systematic bias. The timing was deliberate. These announcements came as Western diplomats were preparing to pressure the Sahel over human rights concerns in their fight against terrorism. The military governments, known as juntas, to their critics and liberators to their supporters, had anticipated this pressure. Their response was not defense, but offense. If the West wanted to discuss justice, the Sahel would expose whose justice had been served for 2 decades. In the streets of Ouagadougou, young people celebrated with drums and dancing. In Bamako's markets, traders spoke of dignity restored. In Niamey's mosques, imams praised the courage to confront modern pharaohs. This was not seen as a legal withdrawal, but as a second independence. This time from judicial colonialism. The Western media immediately framed it as isolation, as these nations cutting themselves off from international justice. But across Africa, from Lagos to Nairobi, from Cairo to Cape Town, a different narrative emerged. 3 nations had finally said what millions had been thinking. Why does international justice only flow in one direction? Why are African generals prosecuted while Western generals retire with honors? Why does the ICC's map of investigations look exactly like a colonial map of Africa? The rebellion had begun, not with guns, but with words that carried the weight of centuries. To understand why September 23rd felt like the breaking of a dam, you must understand the water that had been rising for 20 years. When the International Criminal Court opened its doors in 2002, African nations were among its most enthusiastic supporters. 33 African states signed the Rome Statute, more than any other continent. There was genuine hope that finally, the age of impunity would end. But that hope curdled into betrayal with shocking speed. The ICC's first investigation was in Uganda. Then came the Democratic Republic of Congo, followed by the Central African Republic. By 2008, every single ICC investigation was in Africa. Not one case in Europe, not one case in the Americas, not one case in Asia. The map of ICC action had become a map of Africa alone. The numbers tell a story that words cannot soften. Of the first 30 people indicted by the ICC, 29 were African. The only non-African was a Georgian, and that case was quickly closed. Meanwhile, the invasion of Iraq killed hundreds of thousands. Afghanistan became a graveyard of civilians. Gaza was bombed repeatedly. Yemen was destroyed. Not one Western leader faced charges. The African Union began asking uncomfortable questions. In 2009, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, speaking at an AU summit, called the ICC a new form of colonialism. Many dismissed him as a dictator protecting himself. But when the ICC indicted Sudan's Omar al-Bashir, While ignoring Tony Blair's role in Iraq, even democratic African leaders began to listen. When the court pursued Kenya's leaders over election violence but ignored France's role in Rwanda, the pattern became undeniable. By 2016, the exodus began. Burundi became the first nation to formally withdraw, calling the ICC a political instrument of control. South Africa announced its intention to leave, though it later reversed under pressure. Gambia declared the ICC, the International Caucasian Court, before also pulling back. But the seed was planted. The court's legitimacy in Africa was rotting from within. What deepened the wound was not just who was prosecuted, but what was ignored. Colonial crimes were untouchable. King Leopold's genocide in Congo, which killed 10 million Africans, was too historical. France's massacre of Cameroonians fighting for independence was outside jurisdiction. Britain's torture camps in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising were before the court's mandate. The message was clear. European crimes against Africans had an expiration date, while African crimes against anyone were eternal. The Libya intervention of 2011 became the breaking point for many. NATO bombed a sovereign African nation into chaos, killed its leader without trial, and opened the gates for weapons to flood the Sahel. The ICC's response? Silence on NATO's actions, but investigations into African militias that emerged from NATO's chaos. The court was not just biased, it was complicit in the very disasters it claimed to address. Even the court's defenders struggled with the optics. Louise Arbour, former ICC prosecutor, admitted the court appeared to have Africa bias. But appearances were reality. When challenged, ICC officials would point to preliminary examinations in Palestine, Georgia, or Colombia. But examinations are not investigations. Investigations are not prosecutions. And prosecutions in Africa were the only ones that moved from paper to prison. The Sahel states watched all of this unfold while fighting for their survival. They saw Laurent Gbagbo dragged to The Hague while French forces who bombed Ivorian positions faced no questions. They saw African soldiers threatened with prosecution, while French Operation Barkhane killed civilians with impunity. They saw themselves potentially in the dock, while those who created their crisis walked free. By September 2025, the ICC had become more than biased. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with the international order. Rules for Africans, exceptions for Europeans, accountability for the weak, immunity for the powerful, justice as a tool of control, not a path to peace. The Sahel states did not just withdraw from this system, they exposed it, named it, and rejected it completely. Their declaration was not diplomatic, it was revolutionary. They called the ICC what it was, a neo-colonial institution wearing the mask of universal justice. To understand why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger chose this moment to break with the ICC, you must leave the comfortable halls of international law and enter the hell of the Sahel. This is not a region debating abstract principles of justice. This is a battlefield where villages burn at midnight, where children are recruited by force, where entire provinces slip from government control as the sun sets. The crisis began when NATO's bombs fell on Libya in 2011. Muammar Gaddafi's arsenals, built over 40 years, exploded across the desert. Weapons flowed south like water from a broken dam. Tuareg fighters, Islamist militants, and criminal networks absorbed enough firepower to wage war for decades. Mali fell first, its northern regions consumed by rebellion. Then the contagion spread to Burkina Faso, then to Niger. What started as local grievances metastasized into regional catastrophe. Today, the Sahel is the world's fastest-growing humanitarian crisis. Over 2 million people are internally displaced in Burkina Faso alone. In Mali, entire regions have not seen government presence in years. In Niger, villages along the borders exist in a twilight zone where the state vanishes at sunset and armed groups rule the night. This is not war, as Europeans understand it, with front lines and uniforms. This is survival in spaces where civilization itself is under assault. The armies of these nations are not professional forces trained in Swiss academies. They are young men from the very villages under attack, carrying ancient rifles, wearing sandals instead of boots, fighting enemies who know their families, their names, their fears. When a soldier from Djibo defends his hometown against militants who killed his uncle, is he a war criminal or a son protecting his mother? When a unit from Gao pursues terrorists who kidnapped local girls, are they violating human rights or fulfilling the most basic duty of any state? This is the context the ICC never understood. Sitting in The Hague, prosecutors spoke of proportional response and distinction between combatants and civilians. But in the Sahel, militants hide among populations, strike, and vanish. Children carry bombs. Women are forced to be suicide attackers. The enemy has no uniform, no base, no rules. How do you fight by Geneva Convention standards when your opponent recognizes no conventions at all? The governments that fell between 2020 and 2023, the democratic leaders backed by France and the West, failed precisely because they tried to fight by external rules while their enemies followed none. Soldiers saw their comrades die in ambushes, while politicians in capital cities worried about international opinion. Officers watched territories fall while ministers attended human rights seminars in Paris. The gap between the war's reality and the international community's expectations became unbearable. When the military took power in these three nations, they came with a different logic. These were not career politicians calculating electoral math. These were colonels and captains who had buried their men, who had seen villages they swore to protect reduced to ash, who had watched foreign forces fail to stop the bleeding while lecturing about human rights. Their message was blunt: we will fight this war as it must be fought, not as distant observers wish it would be fought. The ICC's threats of investigation into military operations became intolerable in this context. How could prosecutors who had never heard gunfire in the night judge soldiers fighting for their nation's survival? How could lawyers who lived behind security walls determine what was excessive force in battles where surrender meant massacre? How could a court that ignored NATO's destruction of Libya prosecute those dealing with Libya's consequences? But beyond the immediate military reality lay a deeper principle: sovereignty. For these governments, every external judgment was an erosion of their right to exist. They were fighting wars sparked by external intervention, using weapons flowing from external collapse, against groups often funded by external sources. And now, external courts wanted to judge how they defended themselves. The irony was too bitter to swallow. The alliance of Sahel states, formed in 2023, was their answer. Not just a military pact, but a declaration of philosophical independence. French troops were expelled not because the juntas were anti-Western, but because 50 years of French military presence had failed to bring security. Western aid was scrutinized not from ingratitude, but from exhaustion, with conditions that prioritized foreign values over local survival. When Russian advisors arrived, Western media called it a neo-colonialism, but for the Sahel states, it was simple pragmatism. Russia offered weapons without lectures, training without conditions, support without judgment. In a fight for survival, moral superiority from distant capitals was a luxury they could not afford. The decision to leave the ICC was the logical conclusion of this sovereignty assertion. If these nations were going to be judged, it would be by their own people, in their own contexts, by those who understood the prices being paid. A farmer in Tillaberi who lost his son to militants has more right to judge military action than a prosecutor in Amsterdam who cannot find Tillaberi on a map. This was not a rejection of justice, but a reclamation of it. Justice imposed from outside, they argued, is not justice, but another form of control. True justice must grow from the soil where blood was spilled, speak the languages of those who suffered, and reflect the values of communities seeking peace, not the theories of distant institutions seeking relevance. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger declared they would build indigenous mechanisms for peace and justice, Western observers scoffed. How could nations at war create credible judicial systems? But this skepticism revealed ignorance about Africa's deep traditions of conflict resolution, traditions that predate European courts by centuries. Consider Rwanda's Gacaca courts after the 1994 genocide. Over 1 million cases were heard in community settings where survivors faced perpetrators directly. Villages gathered under trees. Testimony was given in Kinyarwanda, not French or English, and communities participated in determining guilt and reconciliation. Was it perfect? No. But it processed more cases in 10 years than the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda managed in 20. More importantly, it happened where the crimes occurred, in languages victims understood, with communities witnessing justice unfold. The Sahel states are drawing from similar wells. In northern Mali, traditional Qadis, Islamic judges, have maintained order even as state courts collapsed. These are not extremists imposing harsh punishments but learned elders who know Islamic jurisprudence, local customs, and family histories. They resolve land disputes, mediate blood feuds, and maintain social contracts that predate the modern state. In Burkina Faso, the Mogho Naba, the traditional king of the Mossi people, commands respect that no politician can match. His court resolves conflicts through dialogue, symbolic gestures, and community participation. When he speaks, even military commanders listen. This is soft power, rooted not in constitutions written in foreign capitals, but in centuries of accumulated wisdom. The proposal emerging from the Sahel is not to abandon modern law, but to blend it with these traditions. Imagine courts where professional judges trained in national law sit alongside traditional chiefs who understand custom, where testimony can be given in local languages without translation, where punishment includes not just prison but community service that rebuilds what violence destroyed, where reconciliation is not an afterthought but central to the process. This indigenous justice would address what the ICC never could: proximity. The Hague is 4,000 miles from Ouagadougou. Victims never see proceedings. Communities never feel closure. Verdicts arrive like weather from distant skies, unconnected to daily life. But justice administered in regional capitals, in local languages, with familiar faces, becomes real. It becomes owned. It becomes legitimate in ways no foreign court can achieve. The African Union has watched these developments with interest. The proposed African Court of Justice and Human Rights, dormant for years, suddenly seems possible. Imagine a continental court staffed by African judges, applying African interpretations of international law, sitting in African capitals. Not in opposition to global justice, but as an authentic expression of it. Critics raise valid concerns. Will military governments investigate themselves honestly? Can traditional systems handle complex international crimes? Will victims receive real justice or theatrical performances? These are serious questions, but they apply equally to the ICC, which has spent billions to convict fewer than 10 people in 20 years. Perfect justice exists nowhere. The question is whether imperfect justice imposed from outside is superior to imperfect justice built from within. The Sahel states are betting it is not. They are wagering that justice rooted in African soil, watered by African tears, and harvested by African hands will grow stronger than justice imported in diplomatic pouches. They are claiming that legitimacy comes not from international recognition but from local acceptance. This is revolutionary because it challenges the monopoly on defining justice that the West has claimed since Nuremberg. It suggests that universal principles can have particular expressions, that human rights can be protected through different mechanisms, that accountability can exist without Western oversight. If successful, this model could spread across Africa. Nigeria, battling Boko Haram, might create hybrid courts combining military justice with traditional reconciliation. South Africa, still healing from apartheid, might revive Ubuntu-based justice that prioritizes restoration over retribution. Kenya might blend common law with Council of Elders wisdom. The implications extend beyond Africa. If the Sahel can create credible justice mechanisms during wartime, what excuse do stable nations have for accepting external judgment? If traditional systems can handle war crimes, why do modern states need foreign oversight? If Africa can judge itself, who else might claim that right? As I write this on September 26, 2025, 3 days after the Sahel's declaration, the tectonic plates of global power are shifting. This is not just about 3 nations leaving a court. This is about Africa rejecting the entire architecture of international control that has defined the post-colonial era. The West's response has been predictable. Warnings about impunity, concerns about victims, threats of isolation. But these warnings ring hollow from capitals that never submitted to ICC jurisdiction. Washington never signed the Rome Statute. London shields its Iraq War architects. Paris protects its African interventionists. The hypocrisy is transparent, and Africa is no longer pretending not to see it. What terrifies Western powers is not the Sahel's withdrawal, but the precedent it sets. If three of Africa's poorest nations can reject the ICC and survive, what stops Nigeria, with its oil wealth, from following? What prevents South Africa, with its developed economy, from creating alternatives? What keeps the entire African Union from declaring judicial independence? The answer is nothing. And that reality is dawning from Pretoria to Cairo. The African Union, long dismissed as a talking shop, suddenly has an opportunity to become relevant. An African Court of Justice, funded by African resources, staffed by African jurists, enforcing African interpretations of justice, is no longer a dream but an urgent possibility. China and Russia are watching with interest. They never accepted Western legal hegemony and now see potential partners in this judicial rebellion. Turkey, India, Brazil, nations building alternative power centers, recognize kindred spirits in the Sahel's defiance. The multipolar world is emerging not through grand treaties, but through accumulated acts of sovereignty. But the most profound change is psychological. For 2 generations, Africans internalized the belief that legitimate institutions must be validated by the West, that real courts must resemble European courts, that true justice must be blessed by Western observers. The Sahel has shattered this mental colonization. They have declared that African blood spilled on African soil will be judged by African conscience. Period. Young Africans are watching and learning. In universities from Makerere to Legon, students debate not whether to accept Western systems, but how to build African alternatives. In boardrooms from Lagos to Johannesburg, executives discuss not compliance with Western standards, but creation of African standards. In military academies from Cairo to Addis Ababa, officers study not just Western doctrine, but indigenous warfare traditions that protected Africa for millennia. This is not isolationism. The Sahel states continue engaging with partners who respect their sovereignty. But it is a fundamental reordering of relationships. Africa will no longer be the perpetual defendant in humanity's courtroom. It will be a judge, a prosecutor, a maker of laws, not just a breaker of them. The ICC may survive the Sahel's withdrawal, but it will never recover its claim to universal legitimacy. How can it, when an entire continent has declared its justice incomplete, its standards biased, its authority rejected? The emperor has no clothes, and Africa has stopped pretending otherwise. History will record September 23, 2025, not as the day 3 nations left a court, but as the day Africa began writing its own laws. The revolution will not be televised from The Hague. It will be lived in villages from Timbuktu to Kaya, where justice is being rebuilt from the ground up, one case, one tradition, one sovereign decision at a time. The future has arrived, and Africa is holding the pen.